Recorded Books presents Breached: Why Data Security Law Fails and How to Improve It, by Daniel J. Solove and Woodrow Hartzog. Narrated by Jim Frangione. Chapter 1. Introduction. Chronicle of a Breach Foretold. Sometimes the thing we are looking for is right in front of us, and yet we still don't see it. A great novella by Gabriel Garcia Marquez called Chronicle of a Death Foretold begins with the vicious, fatal stabbing of the main character. The rest of the story reveals that all the warning signs about the murder were in plain sight, yet ignored by everyone. The murder was readily preventable, but because of human nature, it was almost inevitable. The story of most data breaches follows the same pattern. We have read about thousands of data breaches, and the moral of most of these stories boils down to the same thing. The breaches were preventable, but people made blunders. What is quite remarkable about these stories is that they haven't evolved that much in decades. The same mistakes keep happening again and again. After so many years and so many laws to regulate data security, why haven't the stories changed? Let us begin with a classic data breach tale involving one of the largest and most notable breaches of its time, the Target breach of 2013. The story has many of the common themes of data breach stories, and what makes it particularly fascinating is that it is a sinister version of a David and Goliath story. Target was Goliath, and it was well fortified. With its extensive resources and defenses, Target was far more protected than most organizations. Yet it still failed. This fact should send shivers down our spines. In mid-December 2013, right in the middle of the holiday shopping season, executives at Target found out some dreaded news. Target had been hacked. It was cruel irony that the second-largest discount store chain in the United States quite literally had a Target sign on it. Target's logo is a red and white bullseye. The hackers hit it with an arrow straight into the center. Executives at Target learned about the breach from Department of Justice officials, who informed them that stolen data from Target was appearing online and that reports of fraudulent credit card charges were starting to pop up. Quite concerned, the Target executives immediately hired a forensics firm to investigate. What they discovered was devastating. Target's computer system had been infected with malware, and there had been a data breach. It wasn't just a small breach, or a sizable one, or even a big one. It was a breach of epic proportions. Target had the dubious distinction of having suffered the largest retail data breach in U.S. history. Over the course of 2 weeks, starting in November 2013, hackers had stolen detailed information for about 40 million credit and debit card accounts, as well as personal information on about 70 million Target customers. The hackers had begun to sell their tremendous data haul on black market fraud websites. The timing couldn't have been worse for Target. It suffered the single largest decline of holiday transactions since it first began reporting the statistic. Target sales plummeted during a season which traditionally accounts for 20 to 40% of a retailer's annual sales. To stop the bleeding, Target offered a 10% discount across the board. Nevertheless, the damage was catastrophic. The company's profits for the holiday shopping period fell a whopping 46%. The pain was just beginning. On top of the lost profits, costs associated with the breach topped $200 million by mid-February 2014. These costs would rise significantly due to bank reimbursement demands, regulatory fines, and direct customer service costs. About 90 lawsuits were filed, leading to massive lawyer bills. What made this all the more unnerving for Target is that it had devoted quite a lot of time and resources to its information security. Target had more than 300 information security staff members. The company had maintained a large security operations center in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and had a team of security specialists in Bangalore that monitored its computer network 24/7. In May 2013, just 6 months before the hack, Target had implemented expensive and sophisticated malware detection software from FireEye. With all this security, an investment of millions of dollars, state-of-the-art security software, hundreds of security personnel, and round-the-clock monitoring. How did Target fail? A common narrative told to the public is that this entire debacle could be traced to just one person who let the hackers slip in. In caper movies, the criminals often have an inside guy who leaves the doors open. But the person who let the hackers into Target wasn't even a Target employee and wasn't bent on mischief. The person worked for Fazio Mechanical, a Pennsylvania-based HVAC company, a third-party vendor hired by Target. The Fazio employee fell for a phishing trick and opened an attachment in a fraudulent email the hackers had sent to him. Hidden in the email attachment lurked the Citadel Trojan Horse, a malicious software program that took root in Fazio's computers. The Citadel Trojan Horse was nothing novel. It was a variant of a well-known malware package called Zeus, and is readily detectable by any major enterprise antivirus software. But Fazio lacked the massive security infrastructure that Target had, allowing the malware to remain undetected on the Fazio computers. Through the Trojan Horse, the hackers obtained Fazio's login credentials for Target's system. With access to Target, the hackers unleashed a different malware program, one they bought on the black market for just a few $1,000s. Experts such as McAfee director Jim Walker characterized the malware as absolutely unsophisticated and uninteresting. At first, the malware went undetected, and it began compiling millions of records during peak business hours. This data was being readied to be transferred to the hackers' location in Eastern Europe, but very soon FireEye flagged the malware and issued an alert. Target's security team in Bangalore noted the alert and notified the security center in Minneapolis. But the red light was ignored. FireEye flagged as many as 5 different versions of the malware. The alerts even provided the addresses for the staging ground servers, and a gaffe by the hackers meant that the malware code contained usernames and passwords for these servers, meaning Target security could have logged on and seen the stolen data for themselves. Unfortunately, the alerts all went unheeded. Furthermore, given that several alerts were issued before any data were actually removed from the Target systems, FireEye's automated malware deletion feature could have ended the assault without the need for any human action. However, the Target security team had turned that feature off, preferring a final manual overview of security decisions. With FireEye's red lights blinking furiously, the hackers began moving the stolen data on December 2, 2013. The malware continued to exfiltrate data freely for almost 2 weeks. Law enforcement officials from the Department of Justice contacted Target about the breach on December 12th, armed not only with reports of fraudulent credit card charges, but also actual stolen data recovered from the dump servers, which the hackers had neglected to wipe. The aftermath of the breach caused tremendous financial damage to Target. It remains unknown what the precise cost of the breach was, but an estimate in Target's annual report of March 2016 put the figure at $291 million. The company's reputation was harmed. The CIO resigned. For customers, there was increased risk of future fraud. Daily spending and withdrawal limits had to be placed on many affected accounts, and new credit cards had to be issued, causing consumers significant time loss while updating their card information everywhere. The breach went down in the annals of data breach history, one for the record books, but it would soon be overshadowed by even bigger breaches. The system is down. On paper, the hackers never should have been able to breach Target. The hackers used cheap methods, such as readily detectable malware that wasn't state-of-the-art. They were quite sloppy and made careless mistakes. Target had much better technological tools and a large and sophisticated team. It conducted phishing tests and employed forensic investigators. The hackers were grossly outspent and outnumbered, yet Target was still felled. At first glance, it seems that Target's Achilles heel was one employee at one of its third-party vendors. Most large companies have hundreds of third-party vendors. This person made just one wrong click of the mouse, and that was all the hackers needed. Had that one person not clicked, then a data breach leading to more than $500 million might not have occurred. That's one very expensive mouse click. However, a prolonged look reveals a host of systemic vulnerabilities. Although on a checklist Target looked healthy, it lost because one key factor wasn't accounted for: human behavior. Spending millions of dollars and installing high-tech software still couldn't prevent the humans from their fateful blunders. It doesn't necessarily take technical wizardry or great skill to be a highly successful criminal on the Internet. Technologies and data ecosystems are so fragile and flawed that it is far too easy for hackers to break in. The black market is overflowing with cybercrime startup kits. Just download the tools and it's off to the races. Because crime committed using the Internet is rarely tracked down and enforced, in most cases, the fraudsters get away with it. We have much to lose. The stakes for data security are enormous. Data breaches, by which we mean the unauthorized exposure, disclosure, or loss of personal information, are not only more numerous, they are more damaging. Every year, millions of people are victimized by identity theft. Their personal data is used by fraudsters to impersonate them. Victims suffer because their credit files become polluted with delinquent bills. Creditors go after victims for the unpaid bills, and victims struggle to prove that the bills weren't theirs. Identity thieves also steal people's identities to obtain medical care, and this has resulted in people losing their health insurance. There are cases where the police have arrested victims because their police records were tainted by the identity thieves. Ransomware attacks are rising dramatically. Ransomware works by encrypting files on people's computers so that the files are unreadable and inaccessible. The data is held hostage. To get the data back, victims must pay the hackers a ransom. Ransomware is incredibly profitable for hackers. It is a frightening world where, at any moment, all our computer files, our documents, our precious photos and videos, our music, our most important information can be held hostage for a ransom. In 2018, the city of Atlanta, Georgia, spent $2.6 million to recover from a ransomware attack on the city's systems that asked for the rough equivalent of about $50,000 worth of the electronic currency Bitcoin. Malicious hackers can readily frame people when data is compromised. They can put incriminating files onto people's computers and then tip off law enforcement authorities. Hackers can also access your most private photos and writings and publish them to the world. They can take over your computer and use it to spam other people or to serve as a conduit through which to commit crimes. As more devices, appliances, and vehicles are hooked up to the Internet, physical safety is at grave risk. Hackers can break into our home devices. They can peer at our children through our baby cameras. They can snoop around through our home security cameras. They can listen in on us through our home assistant devices. They can gain control of our cars. They can also hack into implantable devices in our bodies, such as pacemakers or insulin pumps. As more and more of our sensitive data is maintained in vast dossiers about us, as our biometric information is gathered and stored, such as our fingerprints, eye scans, facial data, and DNA, what will the future look like if organizations can't keep it secure? In Minority Report, a 2002 movie based upon a short story by Philip K. Dick, the protagonist John Anderton is on the run, being pursued exhaustively by the authorities. The movie is set in the future, 2054, where the government and businesses use extensive surveillance technologies. To evade capture via ever-present retinal scanners, John must undergo an operation to replace both of his eyes. The procedure is rather gruesome, but it is necessary given the pervasive use of biometric identification in the story. Imagine the data breach notification letters of the future. We regret to inform you that we have suffered a breach, and hackers have obtained your retinal data, which they could use to impersonate you and gain access to accounts. To guard against future harm, we recommend that you immediately schedule an operation to replace your eyes. We are hurtling forward into a perilous future, with organizations collecting more data and with the consequences of its misuse becoming more dire and even deadly. Data security laws, grand entrance. During the past 2 decades, policymakers have rushed out a body of law to address the worsening data security nightmare. The most significant development is the rise of data breach notification laws, which require organizations that are breached to notify regulators, affected individuals, and sometimes the media. Breach notification is immensely popular. Every state in America, as well as many countries, now have these laws. Unfortunately, breach notification merely alerts victims that their data was compromised in a breach. It doesn't cure the harm. It just informs people of the danger. Then come the class action lawsuits. Sometimes, mere hours after a breach is made public, attorneys file lawsuits against companies on behalf of those whose data was compromised. Many of the suits fail. Others end up settling, with companies paying to save on the cost of litigating the case. Consumers often don't receive any significant benefits or compensation. In the Target case, the consumer lawsuits for the breach settled for a pittance, just $10 million. The settlement was a fee paid not on the merits of the case, but to make it go away. The Target breach affected between 70 and 110 million individuals, which means that the recovery amounted to just a few pennies per person. Victims did not see significant restitution, as the settlement only applied to the reimbursement of notoriously elusive documented damages and reimbursements for lost time, which is often not given much value. After breaches, regulators also step in to enforce, but many times regulators take a pass. There are too many breaches each year, and regulators only have the resources to go after a small fraction of them. When regulators step in, their penalties often just increase the cost of the breach to a small or modest degree. For example, a group of state regulators settled with Target for $18.5 million. With the Target breach costs at an estimated $291 million, this regulatory penalty represents less than 10% of the total. Even if regulators or individual litigants were to recover more in penalties and damages, it's not clear that things would be any different. Of course, greater monetary pain after a data breach might provide a stronger incentive to keep data secure, but organizations already face significant costs for breaches, and the additional incentive is not likely going to be a game-changer. Target was already taking security quite seriously and devoting significant resources to it. Target failed not because of a lack of commitment to data security, but because it made mistakes. Breaches set in motion a series of legal responses that often drag on for years and mire organizations in millions of dollars in expenses. By this time, however, it is far too late. The damage has been done, and the law mostly serves to heighten the expense to companies. While it is important to make sure that organizations internalize the risks they create, the law isn't addressing all other actors that create risk. To make matters worse, the law often fails to help individual victims whose data was compromised in the breach. Despite data security law's obsession with data breaches, the law doesn't seem to be reducing the size, severity, or number of breaches. Data breaches are steadily increasing. The news is inundated with stories about data breaches that were readily preventable through rather inexpensive, non-cumbersome means. Why aren't data breaches slowing down? Why doesn't the law seem to be making any difference? The argument of this book and a roadmap. This is a book about how to improve the law's approach to data security. Our goal is to reorient the way the law addresses actors who create and participate in systems that leave personal information vulnerable to exposure and misuse. Our book is not about cybersecurity in the broadest sense of the term, which applies to all forms of security with systems that use the Internet. Instead, our focus is on data security, a significant piece of the cybersecurity pie that involves personal data. Data security is largely part of privacy, data protection, and consumer protection frameworks like the Federal Trade Commission's FTC enforcement of rules against deceptive and unfair trade practices, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, statutes that govern entities using personal data like the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, and the law of torts that provides a remedy for negligent data practices. Although there is a lot of overlap between optimal regulation for data security and cybersecurity, there are important differences. The risk thresholds, threat modeling, actors affected, and type and magnitude of harm can differ when personal data is involved rather than when supply chains, machinery, or infrastructure are involved. It thus makes sense, in some contexts, to treat data security as unique from other areas of cybersecurity, and the law does so. Data security law emerges more from privacy law than cybersecurity law. Unfortunately, data security law currently exists in an awkward space between cybersecurity and privacy. Being in this space has been a detriment to data security law, which has often failed to incorporate the strengths of both cybersecurity and privacy. Laws addressing privacy issues often include data security as part of their framework. Because the legislative lens is on privacy, legislators typically focus on the individual. Breach notification dominates data security law. The security rules are often vague and sparse. In contrast, cybersecurity law frequently includes more robust security rules based on systems-focused security frameworks. In a cruelly ironic way, data security law also fails to draw strength from privacy law. Data security remains quite siloed from privacy. When it is part of privacy laws, data security is often cabined to narrow sections. Data security law has not fully incorporated privacy law's evolving recognition about designing to accommodate human behavior and protecting human values beyond confidentiality. To make matters worse, the protections in privacy law often fall short in ways that are bad for data security. The fact that data security is often part of the fabric of privacy law is a missed opportunity. Lawmakers could draw from privacy law's toolbox to bring a richer and more nuanced approach to securing personal data, yet so far they have not. In this book, we hope to bring data security law out of this no-man's land to better reflect the overlapping wisdom of privacy and cybersecurity. Because we focus mainly on personal data, we largely leave to others more general critical cybersecurity issues such as infrastructure security, industrial espionage, cyber warfare, computer crime, trade secrets, and proprietary data, and the nuanced debates surrounding the market for and disclosure of security vulnerabilities. Of course, these issues overlap with data security problems. But in this book, we are examining the data security piece of the pie. We also are not seeking to critique the established strategies technologists have developed to protect information. Nor are we proposing new technological approaches to the field of cybersecurity. Rather, as legal scholars, we are drawing from existing security knowledge that the law often fails to embrace. Because we are not technology experts, we will not delve too deeply into technical specifics of data security. Instead, our goal is to develop principles and theories that can guide the law for the foreseeable future. In this book, we propose a general approach lawmakers and judges can take to improve the security of personal data, and we outline a broad set of principles to bring coherence and consistency to a body of law that for too long has been focusing in the wrong direction. Our argument is built around one overarching point: to improve the rules for securing personal information. Policymakers must counterintuitively shift the law's focus beyond data breaches. Too much of the current law of data security places the breach at the center of everything. Turning data security law into the law of breaches has the effect of overemphasizing the conduct of the breached entities while ignoring the other actors and factors that contributed to the breach. We present an alternative, broader vision of data security policy in three areas: accountability, redress, and technological design. It is tempting to say to organizations, "Come on, just be more secure." But data security is notoriously complicated and needs a great deal of calibration. Ironically, some attempts by lawmakers and industry to add more security can actually make systems more vulnerable. Security measures come with difficult costs and trade-offs, so the choice of which ones to use and how many is quite challenging. Data security is a delicate dance between technology and people. The ideal amount of data security is not necessarily to be as secure as possible and avoid a breach at all costs. In most cases, it is a poor policy choice for an organization to have the strongest possible security because the trade-offs are too significant. It is easy to underappreciate the costs of many security measures because costs are often thought of in monetary terms. But the biggest costs of many security measures are that they can reduce functionality, make things inefficient and inconvenient, and be difficult and time-consuming. One of the challenges with data security is that there are no absolute answers, as we are dealing with a continuum of risk and an ongoing cat-and-mouse game between attackers and defenders. Policy choices depend upon not only an assessment of risk, but also an assessment of the costs of addressing those risks. A complicated balancing must take place. Current data security rules fail to address risk effectively. In many circumstances, the law penalizes breaches with little regard to considerations of risk and balance. Other times, the law levies no penalty against organizations even though their actions created enormous unwarranted risks. We contend that there is a better role for law to play. The main lesson of this book is that, time and again, data security law is largely part of privacy. Lawmakers should move beyond the reactionary blaming the breached and hold accountable all the actors in the data ecosystem that contribute to the problem. They should break down the silos between privacy and security. They should promote human-centric security that accounts for the way people actually think and act. Part 1 of this book focuses on the challenges to data security and why the law is not adequately addressing these challenges. In Chapter 2, we provide a brief history of data security in this century. We discuss how and why data breaches started to capture news media headlines. In our brief sweep through the past 2 decades, we cover the most historic breaches and the new security threats that emerged. When looking at the big picture, the war against data breaches is being lost, one battle at a time. There is a lot to learn from data breach stories. There are common plot lines that clearly show us why data security is so often failing. In Chapter 3, we survey the law and policy of data security and analyze its strengths and weaknesses. We conclude that, despite some small successes, law and policy are generally failing to combat the data security threats we face. Data security law is too reactionary. The law often merely increases the cost of data breaches, but fails to do enough to prevent them. Moreover, the law has failed to protect individuals who are being put at greater risk by inadequate data security. In Part 2 of this book, we propose a different approach to data security that we call holistic data security. Under this approach, the law would apply earlier, more frequently, to more actors, and to more activity. In Chapter 4, we introduce our approach, holistic data security, which focuses on the mitigation of risk in an entire data ecosystem. Instead of concentrating solely on individualized harm and specific breaches, data security law should aim to ensure the well-being and resilience of the data ecosystem. Our approach draws insights from fields that focus on entire systems, such as public health. Both data security and public health rules seek to keep a complex and dynamic system safe and thriving. Both frameworks address complex, opaque, and ever-shifting risks that make attributing causation and effective enforcement at the individual level difficult. Both fields are tasked with mitigating the spread of viruses, yet public health law seeks to sustain the health of an entire population by mandating practices that reduce risk across the board. Meanwhile, data security law struggles to look beyond the place where a virus took hold, addressing only the last links in the chain. In Chapter 5, we contend that lawmakers and courts can better distribute responsibility among all the different actors who play a role in the problem of data security, even if they are not proximate to an actual breach. Data breaches are not just caused by the particular organizations that have the breach. Breaches are the product of many actors. It takes a village to create a breach. We provide a survey of these various actors and their contributions to the problem. Unfortunately, the law doesn't hold most of the actors accountable. Policymakers often focus rather myopically on the particular organizations being breached, and they often overlook the fact that data security is a systemic problem. In Chapter 6, we argue that policymakers also often fail to address practices by other organizations that increase the harm of data breaches to people as well as increase the costs. We can't eliminate all breaches, but we can significantly reduce the harm that they cause. In Chapter 7, we address the relationship between privacy and security. Privacy is a key and underappreciated aspect of data security. Right now, there is a schism between privacy and security in companies. Privacy functions are commonly addressed by the compliance and legal departments, while security is handled by the information technology department. The two areas are commonly split apart and rarely speak to each other. We should bridge data security and privacy and make them go hand in hand in both law and policy. Strong privacy rules help create accountability for the collection, use, and dissemination of personal information and can reduce vulnerabilities and risk by minimizing the use and retention of personal information. Good privacy strengthens security. In Chapter 8, we argue that although most failures in data security involve human error, policymakers are not designing security measures with humans in mind. Instead, humans are expected to do things that are beyond the bounds of normal cognition. Far too little emphasis and resources are given to educating people about their role in data security. The result is that policymakers have failed to address the greatest security vulnerability, the human factor. Consider again the Target breach. On a checklist, Target looked healthy. It had good policies, a large security team, significant resources, and strong security software. Spending millions of dollars and installing high-tech software still couldn't prevent human blunders. Humans turned off the software. Humans ignored the blinking red lights. A human clicked on the wrong link. Rethinking law with humans at the center is not just a simple rethink. It goes to the very core of our law and policy regarding data security. It means that many of our existing policies are flawed, and that a number of commonly accepted good security practices are, in fact, bad. In this book, we are calling for policymakers to take a new direction, a fundamental shift in focus. Along the way, we suggest some specific things that the law should require, but we are not aiming to provide a laundry list of particular measures. Our focus is on the big picture. we propose a different way of thinking about data security, and we set forth our vision for how the law can take a different approach. Part 1. A Broader Understanding of Data Security. Chapter 2. The Data Breach Epidemic. Data breaches have been an epidemic. Every year brings countless headlines about companies whose safeguards have been defeated, resulting in the exposure of personal data. Every year, the breaches grow bigger and more numerous. What's worse is that we haven't reached the peak yet. The curve just keeps going up, with no end in sight. Organizations and policymakers can't be faulted for ignoring the problem. Over the years, many organizations have dramatically increased their spending on security. Policymakers have sprung into action, enacting a myriad of new data security and breach notification laws during the past 15 years. But the problem keeps growing. It is difficult to fully understand the scope of the problem. Stats on data breaches differ quite substantially, so it is hard to obtain precise numbers. Additionally, the metric for measuring the extent of the data breach problem is unclear. Some commentators point to the number of breaches in a given year, and others point to the number of records breached. Both figures are subject to some flux and contingency, especially the number of records breached, because one enormous breach can significantly impact that number. Additionally, breaches are often attributed to the year in which they are announced, but this date often is long after the breach occurred. For example, the Yahoo breaches occurred in 2013 and 2014, but weren't fully reported until 2016 and 2017. Is there any wisdom to be gleaned from these statistics? Comparisons from one year to the next have often been made, with each year often being designated as the worst. Despite the lack of precision in the data, the trend over time has been clear, a notable increase in the number of breaches and the number of records breached. For example, in 2005, there were 136 reported breaches involving about 55 million records. In 2018, there were 668 reported breaches involving about 1.37 billion records. We have yet to see any signs that this terrible trajectory will improve. A brief history of data breaches. Ever since data breaches started to be reported, the stories have proceeded in an endless parade of horrors. The unofficial beginning of the data breach nightmare occurred in 2005 with the announcement of the ChoicePoint breach. ChoicePoint, a big data company that amassed extensive profiles of personal data on people, was breached when fraudsters masqueraded as legitimate customers and obtained records on about 162,000 individuals. ChoicePoint's announcement of its breach was one of the first public disclosures by an organization that it had been infiltrated. Before 2005, there were certainly many data breaches, but companies weren't required to report them, so there isn't much recorded history. These were akin to prehistoric times. In 2005, light began to shine on the dark underworld of data security. After the announcement of the ChoicePoint breach, several other companies came forward with their data breaches. Bank of America announced a breach involving 1.2 million records. DSW, a retailer, disclosed a hack that compromised 1.4 million records. Citigroup announced a breach involving 3.9 million records. These breaches seemed to be large until Card System Solutions announced that it had 40 million records hacked. Although there were accounts of a few breaches prior to 2005, it wasn't until this year that the mainstream news started to focus on data breaches. California's breach notification law and the rapid passage of similar laws in other states prompted many organizations to finally air their dirty laundry. Data breaches finally received public attention. InfoWorld and other publications proclaimed 2005 to be the year of the data breach. It wouldn't be the last. In 2006, the average cost of a breach was estimated at exceeding $3 million. As concerns about data breaches mounted, many state lawmakers were jolted into action and passed breach notification laws. The saga continued in 2007. The data economy blossomed. Netflix had just begun its streaming service, and Apple introduced the iPhone. But the fraudsters were also having a banner year. According to an article by the Associated Press, the loss or theft of personal data, such as credit card and Social Security numbers, soared to unprecedented levels in 2007. A gang of hackers infiltrated the computer system of supermarket chain Hannaford Brothers and accessed 4.2 million records. Retailer TJ Maxx suffered an enormous breach of credit card information, which was noted at the time to be the largest hack ever. Initial reports pegged the number of records at 45 million. This huge figure was shocking at the time, but ironically, it was far lower than the actual tally, which was later revised to 94 million. TD Ameritrade's database of 6.3 million clients was compromised through malware. In 2008, data breaches increased by 47% from 2007. Bank of New York Mellon lost a box of backup tapes with personal data, including Social Security numbers. The tapes weren't encrypted, and 12.5 million records were compromised. The breach prompted the governor of Connecticut to declare, "It is simply outrageous that this mountain of information was not better protected." Forbes awarded 2009 the title of Year of the Mega Data Breach. The European Union implemented a data breach notification regime by amending its e-privacy directive. The largest breach announcement of the year was a hack of Heartland Payment Systems involving 130 million records. The breach cost the company more than $200 million, and its stock dropped by more than 77% within a few months of announcing the breach. A breach at software company RockU exposed user account data of 32 million people. Hackers were thrilled to discover that RockU stored the data in plain text without encryption. A hacker broke into a database maintained by the state of Virginia to track prescription drug abuse. The hacker deleted 8 million patient records and demanded $10 million in ransom to recover them. I have your expletive in my possession right now are 8,257,378 patient records and a total of 35,548,087 prescriptions. Also, I made an encrypted backup and deleted the original. Unfortunately for Virginia, their backups seem to have gone missing too. Uh-oh. For $10 million, I will gladly send along the password. This incident appears to be an early harbinger of the ransomware epidemic that would spread exponentially a few years later. 2010 was another gigantic year in data breach history. According to a report by Experian, data breaches were happening on a bigger scale and affecting more consumers than ever. The report noted that 26% of consumers received a breach notification letter. More than 25% of affected individuals had to replace a debit or credit card. The computer virus Stuxnet showed just how vulnerable technical systems were to attack. The virus caused real-world physical effects when it disrupted the centrifuges in an Iranian uranium enrichment plant. Many pundits proclaimed 2011 as the year of the data breach. The loose collectives Anonymous and LulzSec introduced the world to hacktivism, while more profit-minded hackers set their sights on healthcare. Health data breaches increased by 97% in 2011. Even data security firms weren't immune from breaches. RSA Security, which provided security to 40 million businesses, was hacked. A hacker sent phishing emails with the subject 2011 recruitment plan to a few employees. The spam filter caught the email, but one employee retrieved it from the spam folder and clicked on the attached Excel document, infecting the system with malware. The malware enabled the hacker to access the system and obtain credentials to break into other systems. One fateful click also resulted in one of the largest breaches of the year. At Epsilon, an email marketing company, an employee clicked on a phishing email, enabling hackers to access 60 million records. The cost of the breach was estimated to be in the billions. Fueling the rise of data breaches, illicit markets for stolen data began to emerge. Criminals could sell their spoils of personal data, and other criminals could buy key pieces of data to help them plunder. The personal data peddled in this crooked bazaar could be used for answering password recovery questions, to steal passwords, or for filling out fraudulent credit card applications. Fraudsters could also purchase user passwords from previously hacked sites. These passwords are valuable because people often use the same password on multiple accounts. Markets in stolen data thus became a source of revenue for criminals, as well as a place for criminals to acquire data to help them hack other companies. The most prominent of these underground markets was the Silk Road, created in 2011 by Ross Ulbricht, a recent college graduate who longed to be an entrepreneur. Silk Road was an online marketplace that existed in the nether regions of cyberspace, colloquially known as the dark web. The dark web originated in the early 2000s. Because users could remain anonymous and be difficult to trace, the dark web became a virtual bazaar for hacked personal data. Silk Road quickly grew to become a major marketplace in the dark web. Donning the pseudonym Dread Pirate Roberts from the book and movie The Princess Bride, Ulbricht hoped to develop Silk Road into a libertarian utopia, beyond the restrictive authority of governments. Silk Road was made possible by the rise of cryptocurrency, such as Bitcoin, which enabled financial transactions that could be nearly impossible to trace. Silk Road quickly became a cesspool for drug trafficking, murder for hire, and other illegal activities. People could even hire hackers to hack for them. The Hacking Pack was also for sale, which contained more than 100 hacking tools and software programs. At one point, a Silk Road user was able to figure out the identities of other Silk Road users and started to blackmail Ulbricht by threatening to release the names publicly. Ulbricht reached out to another Silk Road user to kill the blackmailer. Ultimately, Ulbricht was caught, convicted, and sentenced to a double life sentence without the possibility of parole. Silk Road was shut down, but the dark web is a much vaster place, and new illicit marketplaces have emerged where hackers can readily sell the personal data they plunder. In 2012, breaches continued at a torrid pace. VentureBeat proclaimed 2012 to be a big bad year for online security breaches. Hackers broke into LinkedIn, accessed its user passwords, and posted 6.5 million of them on a hacker forum. The passwords were not sufficiently encrypted, and many were cracked quickly. Not much happened afterwards, so the damage appeared to be small. But 4 years later, 117 million LinkedIn passwords suddenly appeared online. Later in 2012, Dropbox was hacked, resulting in a breach of more than 68 million user login credentials. The breach was actually a downstream effect of the LinkedIn breach. A Dropbox employee was using the same password from LinkedIn for his workplace Dropbox account. Armed with the password from the LinkedIn breach, hackers broke into Dropbox's network through this employee account. Ransomware began to flourish in 2012. Ransomware is malware that encrypts data on a computer system or device. The victim must pay a ransom to get the key to decrypt, unencrypt the data. Originating in 1989, ransomware suddenly escalated from an obscure occurrence to one of the leading threats online. PC World awarded 2013 with the title of the Year of the Personal Data Breach. Symantec upped the ante and gave this year the title of Year of the Mega Data Breach. According to Symantec, attacks against businesses of all sizes grew, with an overall increase of 91% from 2012. Malware and malicious apps for mobile devices grew substantially in 2013. Ransomware grew like a weed, with a 500% increase from 2012. Target was one of the biggest and most notable breaches of the year, involving 110 million records. Hackers stole login information of 38 million people from Adobe, including passwords and credit card data. Later, an enormous file was posted anonymously online that included login credentials of more than 150 million accounts. Hackers broke into a backup server with inadequate protection because the same encryption key was used for all passwords. Adobe was planning to fix the issue, but it never got around to it. In 2014, many media entities proclaimed the year to be the year of the data breach. Hackers released hundreds of private, often nude photos of women celebrities online, demonstrating that breaches can be acutely harmful and reflective of the gendered Internet attacks on women. 2 more states passed breach notification laws, but the breaches kept coming. One of the most notable breaches announced in 2014 was the Home Depot breach. Criminals remotely stole payment card data from self-checkout kiosks for about half a year until Home Depot discovered the activity. As with many other breaches, the initial hole in Home Depot's armor was an external vendor, where the thieves were able to obtain network credentials. From there, because of a poorly segmented network, the cyber crooks were able to work their way around as if in a giant playground. J.P. Morgan Chase was also breached, exposing 76 million records in the largest intrusion of an American bank to date. Hackers broke in with stolen login credentials from one employee, then exploited a neglected database that hadn't been upgraded to require 2-factor authentication. This simple upgrade could have stopped this debacle from happening, but it was overlooked. J.P. Morgan Chase spent $250 million per year on security, but it was felled by a small oversight. Sony Pictures was attacked in retaliation for its upcoming release of a comedy about North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Attackers backed by the North Korean government broke in by stealing an administrator's credentials through a phishing scheme. On the morning of November 24, 2014, Sony employees turned on their computers to see a red skeleton and a message threatening to release the data publicly. The hackers made good on their threat, publicly posting private emails of Sony employees, including emails by executives, some of whom made insulting comments about celebrities and others. According to a Symantec report on ransomware, between 2013 and 2014, there was a 250% increase in new crypto ransomware families on the threat landscape. As the Symantec report observes, never before in the history of humankind have people across the world been subjected to extortion on a massive scale as they are today. The fact that so many companies were being infiltrated led FBI Director James Comey to state, "There are 2 kinds of big companies in the United States. There are those who have been hacked and those who don't know they've been hacked." The year 2015 earned the title of the Year of the Data Breach, a title that nearly every year has earned. One study noted, in 2010, you had a 1 in 9 chance of becoming a victim of identity theft after your financial or personal information was swiped. Today, your odds have increased to 1 in 3. The health plan Anthem had a breach of 80 million patient records involving very sensitive data. Hackers broke in when one employee clicked on a phishing email. The breach was noted as the largest healthcare breach in history. On the very same day that Anthem announced its breach, Premera Blue Cross discovered it had been hacked, compromising 11 million records. Hackers also attacked Ashley Madison, a website for facilitating extramarital affairs. They obtained 32 million records and posted them online. Although some people had paid a fee to Ashley Madison to delete all their data, the company hadn't done so. Ashley Madison also used weak encryption to store sensitive data. After the hackers posted the data online, several of the people exposed committed suicide. Experian also announced a major breach involving 15 million people's Social Security numbers and other personal data. Ironically, the breach was announced at the beginning of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. In 2016, the total number of records compromised in recorded breaches in all years surpassed 6 billion. Bloomberg News proclaimed that 2016 was a record year. Mossack Fonseca, a Panamanian law firm, had a breach that involved 11.5 million records of wealthy clients from many countries who were seeking to evade taxes. The incident was dubbed the Panama Papers breach. In one of the tardiest breach announcements in history, Yahoo announced a series of breaches that occurred in 2013 and 2014 involving 3 billion records, making this the largest series of breaches in the history of humankind. In 2018, the SEC fined Yahoo for covering up the breach for several years, failing to inform investors, and not fully investigating the breach. The fine is notable for being the SEC's first fine for failing to disclose a data breach. But the fine was just for $35 million, which is low considering the egregiousness of Yahoo's actions. The ransomware epidemic continued, prompting the FBI to issue a warning and request to be informed about new ransomware infections. Ransomware attacks averaged 4,000 per day. The year began with a 300% increase in daily ransomware attacks compared to 2015. Where ransomware attacks previously targeted mainly smaller businesses and demanded small ransoms of a few hundred to a few $1,000s, the criminals began to shift to targeting larger organizations and demanding higher ransoms. They also attacked hospitals. Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center paid attackers $17,000 in Bitcoin in February 2016. By 2020, ransom demands on hospitals or healthcare entities would top $1 million. While politically motivated hacks, hacktivism, gained prominence in 2011 with the growth of anonymous, politically motivated hacks in 2016 targeted major parties. Prominent members of the Democratic Party were hacked in 2016, including John Podesta, chairman of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. Sponsored by the Russian government, hackers sent phishing emails to more than 100 members of Clinton's campaign. When the hackers had trouble infiltrating official campaign email accounts, the hackers turned to targeting people through their personal email accounts, which they used to break in. The hacked emails were subsequently provided to WikiLeaks, which published 20,000 of the hacked emails. In 2017, the story was more of the same. As the Online Trust Alliance noted, surprising no one, 2017 marked another worst year ever in personal data breaches and cyber incidents around the world. The total all-time number of breaches reported surpassed 5,000 and involved more than 7.8 billion records compromised. There are 7.6 billion people on Earth, so 2017 saw the total number of compromised records surpass the total world population. Equifax had an enormous breach involving personal data of about 147 million people. The breach was caused by hackers who broke in through an unpatched software vulnerability. Hackers stole data of 50 million riders and 7 million drivers from Uber. Uber's CEO paid the hackers $100,000 to keep the incident secret, a cover-up that resulted in his ouster and in criminal charges against the chief security officer. Bloomberg News proclaimed 2018 to be the year of the data breach. Alabama became the final U.S. state to pass a breach notification law. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, went into effect, resulting in data protection authorities all over Europe being overwhelmed with notifications due to the law's strict breach reporting requirements. More than a dozen organizations had breaches involving more than 100 million records each. One breach involved 1.1 billion records of India's National Identification Database. Criminals were offering access to people's personal data for a fee, as well as software that could print out identification cards necessary for certain government services. Marriott announced a breach of 500 million records. The breach began in the Starwood Hotel chain's system back in 2014. Marriott acquired Starwood in 2016, but the breach wasn't discovered until 2018. The hackers used a Trojan horse, which allowed them to remotely access the system. The hackers were able to gain access to credit card data and passport numbers, which unfortunately were unencrypted. In 2019, the number of breaches increased by more than 50% from the past 4 years. As early as August 2019, the year was proclaimed to be a landmark year. According to Risk-Based Security, on May 2, 2019, we hit a data breach milestone. The Cyber Risk Analytics research team added the 40,000th breach entry to our ever-expanding data breach database. Continuing the trend, 2019 was labeled the worst year on record for data breach activity. More breaches reported, more data exposed, and more credentials dumped online. Early in the year, a large treasure trove of 773 million email and 21 million passwords were posted in a hacker forum online. The data was called Collection Number 1. Hackers obtained 20 million records from the American Medical Collection Agency, AMCA. Due to the anticipated costs of the data breach, AMCA filed for bankruptcy protection, an ironic move because its business was debt collection. In the fall of 2019, the FBI warned, ransomware attacks are becoming more targeted, sophisticated, and costly, even as the overall frequency of attacks remains consistent. Even worse, a new form of ransomware emerged. Unlike ransomware that just locks up your files, this new type of ransomware attack, dubbed double extortion, also threatens to release personal data to the public. When organizations refused to pay ransoms late in 2019, hackers behind Maze ransomware started posting the personal data online. A never-ending saga. The saga over the past 15 years reads like a Shakespearean tragedy, or perhaps more aptly, it has the plot of a typical work of Franz Kafka. Things start out badly, then get worse. The Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, a public interest organization, keeps a database of publicly reported data breaches. When this manuscript was finalized, more than 9,000 data breaches have been reported, involving more than 11.6 billion records. There are many other organizations keeping track, and their numbers are just as ugly, if not uglier. The numbers fluctuate each year, but the general trend is more breaches and compromised records with no improvement in sight. We should note that the numbers reflect reported breaches. Many breaches aren't reported, either because they don't fit the requirement to report or because they are unknown. According to an estimate by the Online Trust Alliance, the actual number of security incidents is more than 20 times the number of reported breaches. Reported breaches are thus the tip of a much larger iceberg. Each year brings more bad news. Each year steals the crown for the most awful year for data breaches. Are there any records left that haven't been compromised? Will we ever have a good year? The common plots of data breach stories. If you're getting tired of hearing similar data breach stories over and over again, welcome to the world of data security. By now, you might have been hoping for something new, but, alas, to quote the eminent data breach expert Yogi Berra, it has been déjà vu all over again. In a famous book, The 7 Basic Plots, Christopher Booker concludes that all stories use one of only 7 plot structures. A similar book could be written about data breaches, which seem to follow a few basic patterns again and again. The big spend wasn't enough. Many organizations spent a lot of money on security, yet still had big lapses in oversight. Throwing cash at the problem didn't stop the breaches. Some organizations didn't seem to care at all, but even those that did devote a lot of resources to security were lacking. They would buy expensive, shiny armor, but then forget to put on key pieces like the breastplate. Human error opened the door. Many breaches were facilitated by human error. Humans fell for a phishing scam. Humans failed to patch vulnerable software promptly. Humans lost devices with data on them. Humans misconfigured servers. One of the major imbalances in the world of data security is that defenders need to constantly protect the entire perimeter, every entry point and vulnerability. Meanwhile, attackers need just one entry point and only must be successful once. Vendors were a weak link. Many large organizations had sophisticated defenses, but hackers figured out that they had a big vulnerability: their vendors that had access to their computer system. The vendors, typically small to medium-sized companies that provided ancillary services to larger companies, had much weaker security. This allowed hackers to break into the vendors, steal their credentials, and then use these credentials to break into a company's computer system. Too much data was being kept and stored together. Many organizations were collecting data that they shouldn't have been collecting, or retaining it when they should have been deleting it. Breaches grew bigger and bigger, mainly because organizations increased the quantities of records they maintained. Organizations have been collecting and using data faster than they have been able to keep it secure, just like during the Industrial Revolution, when factories sprouted up long before safety and pollution controls were introduced. Law professor Danielle Citron has called these bloated databases reservoirs of danger, an allusion to the precarious but profitable under-regulated water dams during the industrial age. To make matters worse, many organizations stored the vast troves of data they were amassing all in one place. Because data wasn't adequately segmented, once the hackers broke in, they could quickly hit the mother lode and access everything. Devices always seemed to disappear. Lost or stolen devices played a big role in breaches. Story writer and playwright Anton Chekhov famously noted that if there is a gun in Act 1 of a play, it surely will be fired by Act 3. When personal data is loaded onto a portable device, such as a laptop or a thumb drive, it is often lost or stolen. These thefts are a disaster if the data on them isn't encrypted. Data was not encrypted. Many breaches involved failing to encrypt data. In a study from 2004, only 15% of organizations had an enterprise-wide encryption strategy. By 2014, 36% had such a strategy. Given the breach experience in the decade between 2004 and 2014, it is shocking that 64% still lacked a strategy. One click was all it took. Phishing played a big role in data breaches. For many breaches, all it took was one gullible employee to click, and the hackers were able to get inside. For large organizations with thousands of employees, the risk can be enormous. And yet, despite the huge risk, many organizations have not been focusing enough on phishing prevention. Lessons weren't learned. Despite the parade of horror stories, organizations have continued to make the same mistakes and have kept getting burned. Short-term thinking, as well as an "it won't happen to me" attitude, have been pervasive. For example, despite the fact that human error is an aspect of most data breaches, many organizations have failed to train employees about data security. In the healthcare sector, despite HIPAA's requirement to have security training, a quarter of U.S. healthcare employees have never received such training. It's even worse in Canada, where 40% of employers in the healthcare sector do not receive training. Of those that do, it's often not frequent enough. Only 38% were trained annually. These stats are not from 2000 or 2005. They are from 2019, after years and years where the healthcare industry experienced relentless hacking attacks and security blunders. Breaches often involved careless, simple mistakes. There is an even broader, more overarching lesson to be learned from the miserable past 15 years in data security. Most of the breaches involved rather small, overlooked mistakes. It can be easy to get caught up focusing on the Leviathan and miss the low-hanging fruit. This low-hanging fruit consists of rather simple and easy-to-fix vulnerabilities and bad practices. After reviewing more than 1,000 data breaches from 2018, the Online Trust Alliance, OTA, found that more than 95% could have been avoided. Although many organizations fear a diabolical hacker who can break into anything, what they should fear most are the small, careless errors that are continually being made. But the diffuse nature of the risks makes them difficult for individual organizations to address. Over the past 15 years of reported data breaches, there have been many new threats and technological developments. But what is quite remarkable is how the same common mistakes keep getting made again and again.